Good evening, Berean. It's good to be with you again on this Lord's Day as we gather together to study God's Word this evening. We do want to greet those of you who are joining us online for our evening Bible study. Let me begin this evening with an apology. I put a throat lozenge in my mouth because I'm having a little bit of a problem with my throat. And my wife always threatened me if I put a throat lozenge in while I was preaching or teaching that I'd be in trouble. But I think that she heard me one time with it and said, "Don't let that ever happen again." But I think I have to go ahead and do it tonight because I'm a little scratchy. But I'm sure Teresa would have eventually understood. All right, so we've been in chapter 20. We started chapter 20 of Acts last week, and we have come to the I would say the most critical part of this 20th chapter, and that's the farewell speech of Paul, or farewell message of Paul to the people of Ephesus. I began this morning's message with giving you an overview of the idea that there are certain chapters in the Bible which are particularly important for certain doctrines or teachings. And I gave you three examples, the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, the incarnation of Christ, Philippians 2, the spiritual gifts, 1 Corinthians 12. It shouldn't surprise us that certain chapters play a key role in certain teachings or doctrines. And not to say that the rest of what the Bible teaches on those subjects is unimportant, but there are some central aspects to certain doctrines or teachings that manifest themselves in certain scriptural texts. And so I began that way this morning. And then after that, I began talking about the importance of the chapter of Acts, chapter 20. First, we placed Acts 20 where it fits into the outline of the book of Acts. And then I talked a little bit about where this chapter can be helpful. I talked about it can be helpful when you're talking about training future, first I said elders. It's important for elders, obviously. That's kind of a no-brainer. This is a central passage on eldership. We've used it several times in studying eldership as a church, not as the main passage, but as a supplemental passage. It could be the main passage of an excellent study on eldership. And so I talked about that's one of the reasons why it's important. We also talked about the fact that this text helps those who are going into full-time ministry to have a great sense of what that entails. And so this would be an excellent chapter to talk about with men going into full-time ministry, especially in the pastoral area. And then just regular church life. I mean, there's some wonderful things that Paul says here about the church, what the church is. And looking at this passage with an eye to ecclesiology would be very, very beneficial. And so I talked about that a little bit. I also gave you some lists, 3 different lists of some important teachings that came out of this in reference to eldership, in reference to the character of Christian ministry, and in reference to the nature of the local church. After that, I then gave you my divisions of this particular speech by Paul. How does Luke divide it? Luke was there this time to hear it. He didn't have to get the message from somebody else. He was actually there. And so, of course, verse 17 serves to introduce this section. Verses 18 through 24 serve as a review of Paul's ministry in Ephesus. 25 through 35 deals with the issue of some admonitions that Paul had for the church, some commands and directives he had for them. And then 36 through 38 is the farewell, the conclusion. And it shows a powerful story about how Bible teaching and Bible responding lead to connectedness and an emotional attachment. And so we see that there. So, and then after that, we launched in. We only got to, I think, 3 verses, I guess, verse 17, verse 18, and verse 19 this morning. Verse 17, you may have thought I was just going to read over that verse, but you see I spent a little time there because it's fascinating to me that elders were appointed in that church, although it had been in existence for less than 5 years. That's incredible to me. And so it shows us how important eldership is to the local church. It also tells us how some of the hesitancy in appointing elders that we see in the modern church is overdone. Not that elders are not important, they're very important, but the idea that I can be in a church for 10, 20, 30 years and no elders be appointed doesn't make any sense. We then turned to verse 18, and as Paul started the review, we looked at the link between him and those he taught. They saw him in all the different facets of life. They saw him go through life. And verse 18 was a testimony to the connectedness between Paul and the people to whom he ministered. We saw how he ministered with the people that he served, verse 18. Then verse 19, we looked especially at his disposition in his service, the disposition in his service. Paul used the Greek term here for slave, the verbal idea, and so he's really saying, I slaved for the Lord with all humility, tears, and trials. And so we looked at the nature of Christian ministry, its difficulty, that we were slaves of God, we serve as slaves, and how we slave. Any questions on the morning's message? Going once, going twice. Go ahead.
Just kind of throwing this out there. You spoke about how Paul founded the church in Ephesus and how quickly they took root and grew, produced fruit. Have you studied at all or looked at how they turned to the point where in Revelation it discusses the church in Ephesus with a strong warning about how far they fell?
Not really. Now, depending on when you think that book was written. So I have a late date for that book. So that book, I would say, was written in the late 90s. And Paul is these events here, and even so, to take the book of Ephesians. The book of Ephesians was written in the 60s. So there's a 30-year gap. In my understanding, there's a 30-year gap between the book of Ephesians and the book of Revelation. A lot can happen in 30 years, and a lot did happen. Do you see the roots of the problem in Ephesians? Well, I think you can probably see roots of the problem. In the book of Ephesians, you have a very solid church. You have a church that clearly knew its stuff. Paul does have some words of encouragement for them, things they should be doing better. Then you come to 1st and 2nd Timothy, where, again, Timothy is stationed in Ephesus. And so when you get to 1st and 2nd Timothy, Paul has to warn Timothy about some men at Ephesus who were teaching false doctrine. And so you can kind of begin to see by looking at these other books that there may very well have been a problem, maybe beginning to take root there, that eventually led to the situation in Ephesus, in Revelation 2. When we get to Revelation, we have a church that is doctrinally sound, so that matches what we know, but they seem to be at least trending towards a coldness in their passion, in their love for Christ. And how they got there specifically, it's hard to say. It's fascinating, though, based on Pastor Perkins' lesson this morning. Pastor quoted 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, which has the goal of our instruction being love. That was written to Timothy serving in the church of Ephesus. And what's the very thing that was a problem in Ephesus? It was love. It was love. The very thing that Paul had told Timothy to communicate to the church, that the focus of the church ministry was beyond. So it's hard to say exactly why Revelation 2 happened. Again, if there's a 30-year time period, then it's hard to say what caused it directly. But as I said when I first started studying Ephesians with you, Ephesians is one of the few churches in the New Testament that we get to see what it was like when it first started, and then as it grew, and then much later in its life. And we kind of get to see a whole scope of what the church was like. So it's a fascinating thing to contemplate, although we don't have all the information. Go ahead, Lord. Well, what would have to happen for that to take place? Well, I think first off, they need accurate translations. One of the things that, as some of you know, Dr. MacArthur's ministry brought out an adjustment to the New American Standard Bible. And one of the things that they were doing in there, it was trying to translate that word more literally as slave. There's some other stuff that they're doing, but that's one of the things. And so I think it starts with good translations. It also behooves pastors to not read over these texts. I mean, we believe in inerrancy, that every word is inspired. And so that's why we spend time on every word. And so I would say that it takes pastors teaching on this. Dr. MacArthur, I haven't listened to it, but Dr. MacArthur has an excellent study on this term and its use for Christians as we evaluate ourselves as slaves. I think it takes pastors in churches teaching on this viewpoint of Christianity. Again, we live in a very narcissistic church time. I mean, the world has always been narcissistic, but now it's the church. And so this self-occupation doesn't play very well. Slavery doesn't play very well in a narcissistic church. But it's going to take some time and effort to get the church to view itself properly. Any other questions on the morning's message? All right. You look like you want to ask a question. You keep looking at me, but you don't put your hand up.
I was going to say, it's just a starting verse 19. Seems to be a very sobering look at what life in ministry looks like in service to the Lord. I can't remember what book I was listening to, but I want to say it was by Ryle. He was talking about how we have to be honest with people that we are sharing the gospel with about what being a Christian looks like, and it's not rainbows and butterflies and skipping through fields and a life of ease.
It's not what Joel Osteen says.
Yes.
Not even in the ballpark.
Now, it's not your best life. And Paul is making that abundant. This is abundantly clear in this text.
Yeah, I love verse 24. He says, "But I do not consider my life of any account as dear to myself." You know, that's kind of the hallmark of Christian service. You know, if you start with yourself, you're never going to serve other people. And Paul had rejected himself a long time ago. I mean, this is Paul. He's about to be arrested. So, what is this? Maybe the late 50s. What do you think about it? Probably, I'd have to look at my notes to get the exact date, but this is probably the late 50s, maybe mid 50s, maybe a little too late. I mean, he's in prison in the 60s, and so this is he's on his way to Rome for a good 2-3 years. So, yeah, I mean, this is a seasoned Paul here. He's been in ministry for quite some time. This is his third missionary journey. And Paul understood the challenges of ministry very, very well, and speaks from that to these men that will be serving the Lord in ministry. So I agree with you. It's a very sobering look at Christian service. No, so Paul seems assured of bonds, but he doesn't have any idea of his death yet. In fact, when you read the prison epistles, and that would be Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, when you read the prison epistles, Philemon, Paul is anticipating release. Okay, so he doesn't seem to have a sense of his death. And of course, we went through the book of Philippians. Well, we went through Ephesians too, but Philippians especially, we talked about, you know, am I going to die? Am I going to stay on? Well, I think I'm going to stay on so I can serve you. You know, so that section in Philippians 1. When we get to Paul's second imprisonment, which is not in the book of Acts, and that's kind of in 2 Timothy, Paul has a very dire look at himself. I mean, I've run my course. I've finished my race. I mean, Paul is getting ready to die, has a good sense that he's going to pass away. He's going to be killed. And so it's a different type of feel from his writing than we get in the other prison epistles. And so at this time we would say no, he doesn't expect that he's going to die here. He does expect bonds of some form. I don't know if he expected what he got in Jerusalem, the extent of it, but he definitely understood there was bonds waiting for him. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so this is kind of what I talked about this morning a little bit, is that these are not recorded in Acts 19. So we don't have any record of that. So that's why I said that clearly more happened than we see in the record. And so apparently there were, like in most places Paul went, plots of the Jews, and we would take this as the synagogue Jews. They had kicked him out, but that didn't stop the persecution he received from them. So that was just one thing that they did. But there clearly was more going on there in Ephesus than just what we see in Acts 19.
So you're taking that as you're taking those things that he's referring to here specifically happening in Exodus.
No, not Exodus.
In Ephesus. Rather than looking back on some of the things we already had, like we've seen plots of the Jews before against him and assassins and stuff like that. He's not looking that far back.
Yeah, I'm taking this as these comments as being directly from what went on in Ephesus, not the bigger picture of his life. Yeah. All right.